From the United Nations headquarters in New York, this is Disarmament Today.
Good morning and welcome to the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs podcast. My name is Chris King. I'm a Senior Political Affairs Officer in the Office for Disarmament Affairs and I'm going to be your host this morning. And today we are very, very lucky and privileged to be joined by our special guest, Ms. Shorna-Kay Richards, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Jamaica to the United Nations. Ms. Richards has an extensive CV, most of which I won't go into today because we could be here all morning. But suffice to say, she's been in New York since September 2012, and her commitment to disarmament since that time has been evident to all. She is Jamaica's representative to the First Committee of the United Nations General Assembly and the CARICOM First Committee Coordinator. Her experience includes participation in the Arms Trade Treaty negotiations, serving as Vice Chair of the United Nations Disarmament Commission in 2013, and articulating CARICOM's position on international security and disarmament. Coordinating CARICOM's participation in the 5th Biennial Meeting of States to consider the implementation of the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. Finally, she coordinated Jamaica's chairmanship of the First Committee during the 69th session of the General Assembly in 2014. And this morning we're just going to have a conversation about an issue in disarmament that doesn't always get the attention that it deserves, despite the fact that it is on the General Assembly's agenda. It's been on the Security Council's agenda, and yet some feel that it goes a little under the surface, and that, of course, is the issue of gender and disarmament, and how these two issues co-align. So we're just going to ask a few questions. We're going to have a friendly chat, and hopefully we can bring to the fore some of the issues related to gender and disarmament and why they're so important for not just disarmament, but international peace and security as a whole. So I suppose the first question I want to ask you, Shorna-Kay, is Jamaica's been a co-sponsor of the General Assembly resolution on women, disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control since it was first adopted in 2010, including being the lead sponsor in 2014. Why do you think this is such an important issue?
I'm very proud that it was a fellow Caribbean country, Trinidad and Tobago, the then Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bessecer, who took the initiative in her inaugural address to the General Assembly in September of 2010 to call for a focused attention on the situation of women in armed conflict and armed violence. And she did so through calling for the adoption of a resolution on women, disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. But this resolution that she championed was to recognize that women are agents, that women can make a very valuable contribution to disarmament measures at the local, the regional, sub-regional, and of course national levels. And importantly, that this resolution would encourage women's role in terms of participation in decision-making processes relating to disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control. And so this in itself was quite an achievement, I believe. Now, this resolution was called for in the context of the 10th anniversary of the landmark resolution 1325. But importantly, from Jamaica's perspective and CARICOM's perspective, Prime Minister Persad-Bessecer called for this resolution in the context of her lead role for crime and security in the Caribbean Heads of State and Government Cabinet, and she had lead role for crime and security. And so this resolution for Jamaica and CARICOM also was a recognition of the fact that armed violence, this illicit trafficking in small arms and light weapon, was wreaking havoc on our society. And so it was a foreign policy initiative, imperative for Jamaica and the Caribbean region, and therefore we were quite happy to lend our support to this initiative. And this leads me to the 3 reasons why this initiative is very important for Jamaica. And I already alluded to one. It's about armed violence. This resolution mainstreams armed violence. Jamaica is not affected by armed conflict, but statistics within the region shows that we have a serious challenge when it comes to armed violence. 70% of homicides committed in the Caribbean region features the use of a firearm. And therefore, this is, of course, a serious problem for us. It undermines our socioeconomic development, of course, loss of life. Now, most men, of course, are the direct victims of armed violence. However, women are left to be the sole breadwinners and often fall into poverty. Then we have the issue that these weapons, they exacerbate the fatality rate of domestic violence. And so we're therefore pleased that the 2014 version update of this resolution included a reference to the Arms Trade Treaty, but not only to the Arms Trade Treaty, but the very landmark provision on gender-based violence in the Arms Trade Treaty. And a second reason why this resolution is important for us, which I already hinted at, was the issue of small arms and light weapon. It actually makes extensive reference to that, but importantly, the contribution of women's agency in addressing the reduction and prevention of the flow of illicit trade in small arms and light weapon. And a third and important issue for us in the Caribbean region, because we have the issue about data collection. The 2014 version of the resolution also speaks to data collection, not only data collection in itself, but data collection disaggregated by sex and age, which we believe will improve the understanding of the impact, because there's differential impact, of course, of armed violence, and this will guide our national policies in terms of intervention programs and activities.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in that one question, I think. So let's let's break a few of those elements down. And I think the first question is, everything that you said to me then shows that the issue of armed violence and the issue of the arms trade and the issue of weapons, it cuts across so many different sectors of society, and clearly highlights that there is a relationship between disarmament and gender. And yet we still continue to hear that these are two very distinct issues and never the twain should meet. What do you say to people who continue to assert that there is no relationship between gender and disarmament?
Well, the first thing I would say is that let's examine the purpose of disarmament. What is disarmament about? Disarmament is not only about the removal of weapons themselves. Disarmament is about tackling the militarization of people and societies. Disarmament does not take place in a vacuum, nor can its objectives be achieved in isolation. So fundamentally, disarmament is about people. Decisions and experiences in relation to weapons involve human beings operating in a social, economic, and political context. And within that context, gender dimensions cuts across the spectrum of weapons. So if we are thinking about disarmament, if we look at the social and the human context of disarmament, it needs to be addressed in a multidisciplinary way. It needs to be addressed from multiple angles, combining local, national, regional, international levels, and including men and women in the processes. We simply cannot leave out 50% of the population. We need to democratize the disarmament process. Now, when I reflect on this question, because it's quite an important one, I believe that there needs to be a common understanding and appreciation of the relationship between, I think we need to build that between disarmament and gender. And I recall that in 2001, the Department of Disarmament Affairs at the time produced some very useful briefing notes, which looked very much at the nexus between disarmament and gender. And I think we can build on that and use that to advance some common understanding within the disarmament community. There is clearly still confusion about the interpretation or about the term gender. We see that there are varying There are competing interpretations, there are varying cultural starting points, and there are different expectations. And I saw that very much in 2014 when we had that resolution, the Women Disarmament, Non-Proliferation and Arms Control, when the sponsors wanted to include the reference to the Arms Trade Treaty and the gender-based violence. And even though delegation, number of them had voted in favor of the Arms Trade Treaty, they still had difficulty referencing gender-based violence with a preference to say women and violence, and because of the different interpretations about what gender is. Now, I just wanted to add, though, that from our standpoint, to stress that gender does not refer to biological sex. Rather, it is a social construct, and this construct refers to the differential social roles that define men and women in specific cultural contexts and the power relations that underpins these roles. But I wanted to also use the opportunity to highlight something about gender perspective, which is very key, is that gender perspectives can advance the achievement of disarmament goals. And this is very important today because we hear that the disarmament and the arms control goals of the United Nations are neglected, that the United Nations is not living up to its disarmament commitments. And I think a gender perspective can broaden the approach that we have been taking, that very male-centric, state-centric, military approach to disarmament, which has not resulted in much. Perhaps we can move to a human security, humanitarian approach where we can have an interdisciplinary, multidimensional approach to these threats. And these challenges and threats that we face today, they are actually multidimensional in nature. And so instead of spending $1.7 billion on a militaristic response, let us invest in funding peace, in a human security approach. Another key, and this is my final point on this question, is how gender perspective brings more actors on board. It diversifies the actors. And in doing so, we need to open up disarmament. We need to not make it isolationist, but to include civil society, to be transformative. You know, the 2030 development agenda, the approach that was embodied in that is that no one should be left behind. We should bring all the stakeholders. So let's have a people-based approach to security that will result in economic resources being used for funding peace and for increasing development.
Well, thank you. Again, we covered a lot of ground in that question. And the first thing I'd say is that disarmament does not exist in a vacuum. That should be on ODA's website. So, but we're talking here about these cross-cutting issues, about the issue of how does not only does gender impact disarmament and disarmament impact peace and security, but also what's the impact on development? So there's a lot to work on there. But I suppose, based on what you were just saying about gender constructs, and I think we all know that 2015 has been a big year for gender constructs and sort of working on the idea of what exactly it is to belong to a gender or a biological sex. I guess the one thing I wanted to ask then, going forward from that, is how do you bring more men into the discussion of gender in a disarmament context? I mean, look, having said that, obviously ODA has a man as a gender focal point. That would be myself, and this is a good start. But these constructs that you're talking about and breaking things down so that we become about humans rather than genders. Like, how do you bring the more men into that conversation?
Well, first of all, congratulations on your appointment as the gender focal point. I mean, that is definitely a step in the right direction. And the fact that you're a part of the strategic planning unit means that we already have a tool to make some advances in that area. But a first step, of course, is awareness building around these gender constructs. So I think it's time that we start to talk to our male colleagues in the disarmament community that, yes, gender, when we speak about gender, it's not about just women. It's about uncovering the constructs that we have when men are victims. And we saw that recently with the publication by Reaching Critical Will on sex and drone strikes, I think it was called. And from my understanding, quite a number of First Committee male delegates were quite interested because of the angle, because for the first time they're seeing that men are actually victims. So perhaps we need to change the conversation to bring more men on board in terms of doing awareness building. This is the awareness building and bringing men on board as agents of change. Is something that I think UN Women is working on. They have a He for She campaign, and perhaps we could have a He for She campaign for disarmament. And Chris, as you start your role as gender focal point, I know you'll be looking at some creative ways to bring more men into the conversation. So looking at very targeted campaigns in the disarmament agenda. But as you rightly mentioned, showing that disarmament is about people. It's about people, starting that conversation, showing that men are also victims, that they are expendable, and that we should reject that approach, that we should reject a militaristic approach to the issue of peace and security. It's failing, it's not working. So that would be a useful start. And as I said, the UNODA has been the first UN entity, actually, to have this action plan for gender mainstreaming. But it's more than just having the action plan. I suppose right now it's about getting the constituency really understanding what it is to have a gender perspective, what gender analysis mean, what gender diversity mean, what looking at the gendered harm of armed conflict and violence, what does it mean? Having that conversation. And I hope in the next First Committee, or whether it's in the margins of whatever disarmament fora, that we can have some bigger discussions, some events or side events to start having that conversation.
Thanks, Shorna-Kay. I think you touched on a really interesting point there about the He for She campaign for disarmament. I want to now go back to something you also mentioned earlier, which is Security Council Resolution 1325. As you know, there was a global study released earlier this year marking the 15 years since the resolution. In your view, what were the key findings of that study, and how do you think that the international community can more effectively and fully implement that resolution, in particular to make advances in the 4 mutually reinforcing pillars: participation, protection, prevention, relief, and recovery?
Okay, well, yes, this was quite a historic year on so many fronts, including for the 15th anniversary of Resolution 1325 and this important global study. And I'm happy to share from my perspective some of the key findings of the study. The first is that, and I think everybody agrees with this, is the remarkable impact of women's participation in all areas of peace and security. The finding shows that the inclusion of women in peace processes leads to more sustainable peace and enhanced prevention efforts. I think the executive director of UN Women captured it best in her remarks to the recent open debate celebrating the anniversary of Resolution 1325. And in her words, she said, the most underutilized tool we have for successfully building peace is the meaningful inclusion of women. That is a very powerful finding. And so women's participation and leadership have a positive impact, according to the finding, whether we're talking about humanitarian, whether we're talking about strengthening, enhancing, improving in the area of humanitarian assistance, in the area of protection of peacekeepers, whether we're talking about the conclusion of peace talks and the sustainability of peace agreements, or economic recovery after conflict, or countering violent extremism. The inclusion of women has a positive impact. A second key finding, which of course demonstrates some of the concerns though, is the lack of consistent implementation. So here we have, after 15 years, a strong normative framework with Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions. But what the study has shown is implementation gap. There is an implementation gap, both at the UN and on the ground. And what is happening? Women's participation is not prioritized. It is seen as an appendage, still seen as a non-political component instead of being critical, instead of being core. And so this has affected consistent implementation because it's symbolic. Now, the study also, which I wish to highlight, found some obstacles to the full and effective participation of women. Failure to allocate sufficient resources, so financing, means of implementation, a big problem. Another issue is lack of political will, which we really need to deal with. Accountability, lack of expertise and awareness. And of course, what is always so difficult, changing attitudinal and institutional barriers, the systematic problems. These are still obstacles. A fourth finding is the need for women peace and security agenda to be integrated into the international community's effort currently to counter violent extremism and terrorism. And that is very important because we are now grappling globally with how we can deal with this issue. A fifth finding, which is very important for me, is the fact that the study shows the benefits of investing in preventive action. I believe we need to reclaim the original vision of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is about conflict prevention. It's not about making war safe for women, but it's about ending war. And that is an important finding for me. But as you mentioned, you asked how, moving forward, how do we, as an international community, fully and effectively implement this agenda? And I will share 3 areas. The first is participation. And we talk about meaningful participation, but as the Secretary General's report on this issue said, we need to go beyond the rhetoric, We need to go beyond it. And so we need to embrace the peace process as a life cycle, and women participate in all aspects of this life cycle, whether it is the first assessment, the initial planning, the negotiation, the monitoring, the assessment. The women need to be involved in the entire life cycle of the process. And we also need to systematically include gender analysis. Meaningful participation touches on civil society and women organization. We need to ensure that they're there, that civil society, as I mentioned, human rights defenders. We also need to ensure that they're part of the discussion, that they're on the delegations. And of course, we need to find the financing to allow them to build capacity in terms of advocacy and negotiation. Now that leads me to the second point about financing. We need to have greater and more sustained financing for this agenda. And an important observation is that we need to really redirect military spending, which is 13 times higher than development aid allocations. We are spending over 14 billion, so we need to redirect that to funding this Women, Peace and Security agenda. And finally, conflict prevention. We need to redouble our efforts to address the root cause of conflict. The militaristic approach responses that we have today is not working. We really need to start funding conflict prevention approaches. And so the 2030 development agenda invites us to address the root causes of violence. And so, which gives rise to violence, insecurity, and injustice. And with this transformative agenda, together with looking at our responses, let's focus on conflict prevention.
Thanks. I love this idea of the life cycle. I think that's a really useful point and a really useful analogy, is to focus that, there is an ongoing cycle here that has a beginning and an end, and then probably a beginning again. And it's interesting to me that so many of the issues that you've just raised that are plaguing, proper analysis of gender and the proper integration and implementation of gender. I mean, these are issues that generally plague the disarmament movement across the board, which is implementation, financing. So there's a holistic point there too. One of the issues that you touched on earlier, and that relates to what you were saying before about participation, integration, and also the military spending issue, is the Arms Trade Treaty. And as you know, we're coming up on 1 year of the entry into force of the ATT. one of the ATT's most significant aspects was that it was the first disarmament instrument with a legally binding provision on gender-based violence. How do you see this playing out in implementation? How have you seen this playing out in implementation? It's a year later. Admittedly, the Secretariat is obviously not up and running yet, but I'm just wondering if from your perspective in Jamaica, whether you've seen anything, states are responding to this, civil society is responding to this?
Well, yes, it is indeed early days, but in terms of the gender-based violence provisions in the Arms Trade Treaty, there will be some challenges, and these challenges relate to the loopholes that remain in the treaty and interpretation, and so this has implication for meaningful implementation. And we know that, of course, the ATT will be implemented by the export licensed professionals. They will be doing the risk assessments, but they will be following operational and procedural guidelines rather than engaging in legal analysis. And so at this early stage, it's very important for state parties, for civil society, experts, including women rights organizations, to start developing a robust risk assessment regarding this provision so that we will have a very consistent and from the very outset strong interpretation and application of this provision. And I note that there's also scope because this is the first treaty and this is the first time that gender-based violence is being included in a legally binding instrument with relation to human rights and humanitarian law. So there is clearly a role to be played between the UN human rights body as we develop very robust criteria for implementation.
Sure. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, a phrase of yours that struck me, which was the need to democratize the disarmament process. That's a powerful statement. Because I think as you've touched on a little bit, it's fair to say that, there are good intentions and efforts, but many even in the disarmament community still view gender as a niche issue rather than as a core element. You mentioned that before. I was hoping you could expand a little bit on how disarmament and security policy communities can avoid tokenism in addressing gender.
Well, the first thing I believe is that how we can avoid this tokenism, and it's important that we avoid it indeed, is to ensure full integration of gender perspective, gender analysis. It should not be peripheral. It should not be periphery consideration. It should be cross-cutting across the disarmament spectrum. And so taking into account the differential gendered impacts, gender diversity negotiations, and in the elaboration of relevant disarmament instruments. And importantly, a gender analysis of the dimensions of the challenges that we're responding to, that we're facing. But an important point I want to make in this regard is that we should seek to ensure that gender-related issues do not become exclusively soft issues, that they must command higher security priority. And so with that, you would have more adequate attention and resources dedicated to, it would be mainstream. It will not just be an appendage. It's systematic integration, we believe, would help to move it from being tokenism. Another point I wish to make is to address, and I already touched on that, gender diversity. And this is the issue of underrepresentation of women, whether in delegations and on panels. And of course, we have heard about the campaign, say no to all male panels, right?
The man panels campaign.
I'm not
exactly.
sure if UNODA has taken a stance on that, but it's civil society taking an initiative that, yes, we need to really examine that very carefully to ensure that we are in a very systematic way including the gender perspective, taking everybody, the views, the experiences of all the actors, all the stakeholders on board. And so we need to address that. Training and capacity building, of course, is very important. And I'm very pleased that the UN REC, which is the UN Regional Center for Disarmament, Development, is it?
In Latin
America and the
Caribbean.
Caribbean, in my region. Melanie Reichenbach has done a wonderful job in really paying attention to capacity and training, and either through having these small arms training for women security officers, or in trying to see how we can gather statistical information that will look at the impact of small arms and armed violence on the society. It's very important. So it's becoming more practical implementation of the gender perspective. Another important issue in avoiding tokenism is how we frame the issue of women. We should avoid framing women primarily as, or categorizing them as, vulnerable or innocent. And so not doing so will allow us to have women playing a more active role in disarmament discussion, negotiation, their agency. And so we need to avoid this framing of women in our documentation, in our resolutions. Let's avoid that. Another important issue is that entry point is that we should encourage increased dialogue between gender, security, and disarmament experts here in the international system, as well as in our own national setting. I mean, in my own country, we need to really encourage that, so it will become automatic to have these players interacting in this cross-cutting, cross-sectoral approach. And one last thing I would like to add is that diplomats like myself and civil society need to spend time highlighting the link between gender and disarmament in the relevant UN fora, in the entire international community, so it becomes mainstream. And so it's not just about having an action plan, but operationalizing that action plan, monitoring it, evaluating that action plan, and making it systematic.
Those are all excellent points, Shorna-Kay. Thank you very much. Just going back to the training and capacity building issue, ODA's Vienna office is running a new education and career development program for young women professionals to encourage more women to pursue careers in disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control. What advice would you give to such women in terms of how to pursue this career and on the need to pursue this career as well?
Well, let me start by commending the UNODA for this initiative. And I gather that this initiative is targeted at women in the global south as well, which is quite important.
It is, absolutely.
So I think it's a step in the right direction in building a critical mass. So as you mentioned about why is there a need? We need to build a critical mass of women working in the field of disarmament, and so that they can exert, I believe, influence in prioritizing conflict prevention and the promotion of peace. Now, what advice would I give to them? Exactly that here you have an opportunity to enhance your knowledge, your insights, to make a contribution within your area, your sphere, to challenging the traditional narrow concept of security. But it's not easy, because without a critical mass, it's very difficult, as you know, for women to make to exert that influence. And what I would say to them is make good use of this opportunity when you return to your working space. Do not succumb to the need to live up or to conform to what is the prevailing approach, the male-dominated, the militaristic approach to the stereotypes, but find a space, allow yourself to find a space, even if it's a small space, to try and bring that human security, humanitarian, broader perspective to what you're doing. And I would also give an advice to the UNODA as well, that we hope that this program will show that there are women represented in imparting this knowledge, and that the curriculum is geared towards showing that women are agents, women can make a contribution at the highest decision-making level in addressing our peace and security challenges. And I also want to add one last thing again about the critical mass, that you're a multiplier of change. And so in your own small way, you can make a contribution. I had the opportunity, like you, Chris, mine was in 2005 to be a UN Disarmament Fellow. At the time, when I was reading the application, it did say that you'd give to encourage women participation. In my service, we have quite a number of women, so that part was easy. But I remember the coordinator of the program telling me at the time that that they had second thoughts about awarding this fellowship to me, to Jamaica, because over the years we had not placed fellows from the program in when they came to the United Nations to deal with disarmament issues in the first committee. And I made a promise then that if I ever serve in New York, that I would certainly give attention to working, to make a contribution to the disarmament agenda. And I am very proud that it took 8 years, but 8 years later, I came to New York, and in 2012, the 67th session, I had the opportunity to participate in the first committee session, and I've done 4 of them. But and it has been a very good experience because I've been able to work from the very get-go on issues of importance to Jamaica, the Arms Trade Treaty, small arms and light weapon, the UNPOA. And an important promise that I made was in an address in Hiroshima, that I would, if I'm here in New York, deal with the issue of nuclear weapons and the elimination of nuclear weapons. And I'm very happy that I now have the opportunity to be working, to be a part of, to lend Jamaica's voice and support to the humanitarian initiative, to the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And so in that sense, I feel that I've come full circle, and that through this fellowship, which equipped me with certain knowledge and understanding to make a contribution in whatever way, as a woman, but as a small island developing state, to add our voice to advancing the achievement of the disarmament goals.
Well, I think I can safely say on behalf of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs and the disarmament community that we're very grateful and happy that you managed to fulfill that promise. Because, as I said earlier, you've made a great contribution to the disarmament agenda. And I hope you continue to make a contribution to the disarmament agenda, particularly that very, very critical issue, that, dare I say, existential issue that is nuclear weapons. Thank you very much, Shorna-Kay. And thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on the podcast this morning. And with that, my name is Chris King. Thank you for joining us on the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs podcast. I hope you have a great day, and happy holidays to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.